Dara Lennox sat in the ruins of her brother's verdict, fingers trembling around an untouched glass of synthetic scotch. As the news replayed the footage for the third time that hour, a corporate drone slicing the sky over an aid convoy, her brother's face blurred by fire and debris. The jury had ruled it an automated systems failure, and the defense team toasted their win while Dara's career imploded under the weight of her grief and fury. Disbarred for contempt, reckless accusations, and the public spectacle of screaming at the corporate CEO during closing arguments, she hadn't left her apartment in weeks. The galaxy, however, refused to wait. News broke across every channel. The Valari Empire had landed shock troops on Mars, Kane torching human habitats and claiming dominion by ancient right. Earth's military prepared to respond, but didn't. They couldn't. The Treaty of Civilized Species, ratified after the last galactic war, forbade conflict of any kind. No warships, no weapons, not even retaliation. Violators were collectively sanctioned, sometimes erased. The only legal option left, litigation. A summons was issued by the United Galactic Assembly. Trial would determine if Earth had violated its colonization protocols and whether its people still deserved sovereign status. Dara ignored it until her doorbell rang. Standing there was a stranger with silver-threaded eyes and a voice like cooled glass, Ambassador Rickon. A half-human, half-synthetic diplomat, once exiled from the Assembly for backing Earth's admission. "I've read your case," he said calmly, stepping over the piles of unopened mail. "You lost, but not because you were wrong. You were outgunned, outclassed, out-resourced. That won't happen again." Dara laughed bitterly, already turning him away. "You don't need me. You need a miracle." "Good." But Rickon held out a single document stamped with the seal of the Assembly Court. "Earth has no standing council. The governments are paralyzed. The cores are lobbying to negotiate. They'll settle for being assets." His voice dropped. "You want justice? You want to make them pay for your brother? Then come to the stars. Win this, or humanity becomes property." Dara stared at the file. It wasn't just her brother this time. It was everyone, and they were trusting a courtroom to save them. The same courtroom that had already betrayed her. Hands shook again, but this time, not with grief, with purpose. Maybe the last shot fired wasn't war. Maybe it was silence. But that didn't mean surrender. It meant opening statements. Dara Lennox never forgot the taste of copper smoke and desalinated water, the staples of the Pacific quarantine zone, where corporate security drones flew lower than birds, and the sun filtered through a haze of industrial runoff. She grew up in the shadow of barbed wire and plasma fences, where law was a language spoken only by the rich and enforced with military precision against the poor. Her mother died of inhalation cancer when Dara was 12. Her brother Eli was 16 when he first taught her how to file a grievance with his own tribunal, and 24 when he was reduced to ash by a contractually permissible defensive measure issued during a humanitarian convoy. That death made Dara a lawyer, but it was the verdict that made her dangerous. Now, with her license suspended and her life unraveling, she stood aboard the UN tribunal ship, Clarion, staring out at the stars like they might blink and judge her. She hadn't planned to say yes, but guilt doesn't negotiate. It simply drags. Alongside her, Marcos Vel adjusted the magnetic clamps on his prosthetic leg with a groan, the metal humming against the ship's floor. Once a missile commander, in the Jovian uprising, Marcos now weaponized technicalities instead of warheads. "They used to call me the Butcher of Ganymede," he told her with a shrug. "Now I make rich bastards cry over footnotes." He laughed at everything except when he woke up screaming. Then there was Lincoln, the ship's legal AI, Earth's finest minds modeled into a single consciousness, armed with precedent, protocol, and zero tolerance for sentiment. He appeared as a flickering hologram in the trial chamber, a wireframe visage with perfect diction and no pause for empathy. Emotion, he often reminded Dara, is irrelevant to adjudication. Dara hated him on sight, but relied on his recall like oxygen. The Clarion cut through Vela-controlled space, escorted by 2 diplomatic corvettes whose weapons were locked behind legal seals. No one could fire, no one could threaten. The only combat allowed was in words, and, waiting for them at the border, tribunal ring, was Prosecutor Velmar Sleek, violet-skinned, his robes trimmed in platinum thread, his eyes devoid of compassion. "You are unstable, unsanctioned, and historically recursive," he told Dara upon first meeting. "A species of noise. We intend to quiet you." Dara stared him down. Good luck with that. The stakes were no longer abstract. If Earth lost, the Valari would gain legal dominion over every human colony. Oxygen rations, employment rights, childbearing quotas, all contractually dictated. It wouldn't be war. It would be ownership. The Earth would sign with its silence. Dara looked to the stars again, not with awe, but with the grim certainty of someone who'd finally learned where home ended and the fight began. The tribunal chamber pulsed with ambient light and ancient law, a floating cathedral of jurisprudence orbiting a dying blue star. Fitting, Dara thought, since Earth's future now hung on a clause buried in forgotten ink. On the opening day of the Galactic Tribunal, Valari Prosecutor Velmar strode to the center dais and unveiled his weapon, an obscure, dust-covered corporate contract from 2045, signed by a now-defunct Earth conglomerate and notarized by a multi-system witness species. The document, dry, technical, and chillingly real, transferred planetary sovereignty as collateral for interstellar mining rights. Legally binding, Velm declared, and still in effect. Dara's blood ran cold as Marcos cursed under his breath. Lincoln confirmed the signature's validity, even as his algorithms stuttered at the implications. Clause 17, he recited flatly, renders Earth a provisional holding under extrajudicial oversight if the signatory failed to repay its debt. The company in question had folded a century ago. Its debts had never been paid, but in galactic law, corporate contracts trumped sovereign rulings, especially when notarized beyond one star system. Dara stormed forward, her voice breaking through the sterile hush. That contract was a fraud. There was no consent, no informed intent. We're not bound by the dead sins of a dead company, but the tribunal, a council of 14 species, some with no concept of personal autonomy, remained motionless, their decision as cold as deep space. The trial would continue. Dara's words, "We are not signatures. We are people." People change, echoed through the chamber like a prayer unanswered. Then came the final twist, sliding in like a blade. From the Valari delegation emerged Judge Harrow, the mentor who had once shaped her into a fighter for justice. His voice, once thunder in Earth's courts, now defended the Valari claim with surgical precision. He'd sold out, Dara realized, traded truth for comfort, integrity for alignment with power. He had let her fall years ago during the bar inquiry, and now, here he was, standing beside the very species threatening her planet. It wasn't just law anymore, it was personal, and Dara Lennox had never been more certain this trial would break her or remake everything, in the sterile hum of the Clarion S legal archive chamber, surrounded by volumetric displays of centuries-old contracts and fiscal metadata streams. Marcos Vel leaned over a table cluttered with encrypted financial records, his synthetic leg ticking softly as he shifted his weight. What he uncovered bled corruption. The Valari Empire had methodically infiltrated the Galactic Tribunal through shell corporations, cryptid donations, and centuries of soft power. Judges bribed with planetary estates, starship companies, bought out quietly. Even Earth's own senators on Mars listed as silent partners in Valari resource firms. The law wasn't just broken, it had been sold. Kara, meanwhile, moved through the depositions like a ghost in a tomb. Question alien CEOs with translator drones hovering above, interviewing human tech brokers who spoke with false smiles and empty eyes, confronting collaborators who justified their treason with hollow phrases. We're securing humanity's future. Every testimony struck something deeper in her, every lie, every evasion, every contract written to protect the powerful and grind down the helpless felt like echoes of her past. Of the courtroom where she'd watched her brother's death be sanitized and monetized. Her voice grew sharper, her eyes darker. Occasion observed silently, occasionally offering cold advice. The emotional appeal is ineffective. Use code violations. Attack their standing. Cage precedent. Cage Marcos urged her toward vengeance, his hands shaking when they weren't curled into fists. Don't give them dignity, he snarled after one session. Make them bleed. But Dara was cracking, her rage bleeding into exhaustion, until one night, in her quarters, she found a message fragment hidden in Eli's old comms archive, a single voice memo recorded 2 days before he died. If they write the rules, Dar, he said softly, then change the game. The words hit like an oxygen drop. Suddenly, she remembered who she was. Not just a lawyer, not just a survivor, but a fighter. And Earth's oldest weapon wasn't war. It was complexity. The next day, she returned to court with fire in her voice and dusted volumes of tearing legal history in her arms. She began invoking pre-UN Earth traditions, Byzantine maritime sovereignty clauses, cursive ethics doctrines from early AI human disputes, 21st century case law on digital personhood. She looped the Valeri in nods of contradiction. Footnotes, cross-referencing alien legal systems with centuries-old Earth caveats, building traps within traps, using outdated yet still valid procedural rules. The Valari delegation, once confident and smooth, began to stammer. Their lead counsel requested multiple recesses. Even Lincoln, analytical and cold, paused during one argument and said, "Strategic elegance achieved." But Judge Harrell, towering behind the tribunal bench like a specter from her past, struck down her motions one after another, citing jurisdictional incompatibility, linguistic ambiguity, or simply irrelevance to galactic order. The facade shattered, and Dara confronted him in the judge's chamber, fury trembling in her voice. "You taught me to believe in law. Now you twist it to silence truth." Harrow's face remained unreadable, aged not by time, but by compromise. The galaxy doesn't want truth, Dara. It wants order. You were always too loud to survive in either. High's words hit like a verdict. Alone that night, staring out at the nebulous, routed void, Dara finally understood. This wasn't a trial for justice. It was theater to preserve illusion. She couldn't plead her case. She'd have to break the stage. The risk was total. Her reputation, her safety, even her soul. But if Earth's only path to freedom was through the fire, then she would walk it. Not as a lawyer who bowed to a broken system, but as a revolution hiding inside legal robes. The courtroom felt like the center of the universe. Time crystallized beneath the glow of ancient jurisprudence and cold starlight. Dara stood at the dais, voice raw but steady, breath sharp as she presented what she and Marcos had unearthed deep within the archaic legal strata of the original contract. A single, buried provision clause. 19, subsection 3. A footnote. 2. A financial safeguard in the Galactic Financial Ethics Act, 79B. It was arcane, ancient, and almost forgotten, but it read with chilling clarity. Should any contracting party be proven to engage in exploitative financial behavior under the guise of diplomacy or sovereignty, their assets shall be subject to total liquidation under interstellar equity. Enforcement. Marcos called it the bankruptcy bond. Lincoln ran simulations. There was precedent, barely. From the collapse of the Obsidian conglomerate in 2130, a case sealed and erased from most archives. If Dara could prove the Valari were not a civilization, but a commercial shell masquerading as an empire built not on sovereignty, but on extractive economics and legal indenture. Then, the consequences wouldn't just invalidate their claim to Earth, it would open their holdings to galactic repossession. In open court, Dara laid out the structure. Velmar dismissed it with a cold smile, calling it a desperate parlor trick by a collapsing species. But then, Lincoln activated the archive, dropped to 3.2 terabytes of classified and recovered financial architecture, projected into the tribunal's shared datasphere. Evidence that Valari citizenship was granted via employment contracts, without rights, were assigned based on shareholder tier, that imperial taxes were actually performance-based quotas, and most damning of all, that the Valari Emperor, revered as a divine being, was legally incorporated and listed in dozens of planetary filings as Chief Executive Officer. Gasps rippled through the chamber, some voices translating into shock, others into furious cross-species debate. The room fell into chaos, but Marcos wasn't done. He rose, limping but unwavering, to summon the final witness, a trembling Valari child, no older than 10 Earth years, whose identity file had been legally marked resigned from civic status by a corporate tribunal. The child's parents had defaulted on a tax technically, a performance breach, and under Valari law, their offspring had been unlinked from state support. On paper, the child no longer existed. "He's not a citizen," Marco said. "He's an asset disposal." The silence that followed was planetary. Even species without tear ducts turned away. Judge Harrow, for the first time, didn't speak. He simply looked down, the weight of decades folding into his shoulders. After a full cycle of deliberation, the ruling arrived. Earth was not only innocent of contractual violation, it was wrongfully targeted by a predatory commercial entity. The tribunal stripped the Valari of legal sovereignty. Galactic banking systems, bound by 7-9B, triggered automatic enforcement. Within hours, creditors began seizing Valari holdings, ships, planets, luxury sectors, even their diplomatic fleets. The empire collapsed, not in flame, but in silence, its power devoured by the very law it once wielded to enslave others. Dara stood amid the fallout, victorious but hollow. She hadn't just won the trial, she had detonated an empire with legal code. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would she. The Valari delegation didn't crumble all at once. For a few seconds after the verdict, Velmar simply stood there, mouth slightly open, as if the words hadn't reached him. Then came the calls coded, silent, urgent across their encrypted networks, activating diplomatic contingencies. But it was too late. The ruling had triggered an automatic cascade through the galactic banking accord system. Banks, trading, houses, and allied enforcement firms lit up with seizure rights. Drones were launched, transit lanes rerouted, commerce corridors collapsed. Valari ships were boarded not by warriors, but by clerks with legal mandates, backed by centuries-old interstellar law. There were no sirens, no screams, just a quiet, methodical dismemberment of an empire by accountants with guns within 30 hours. Cana, Valari Prime's central exchange, halted trade. Their imperial flagship, once hovering above the tribunal in symbolic supremacy, was impounded in orbit by a fleet of bonded repos. Their emperor's personal estates on 5 moons were auctioned off via tribunal-verified smart contracts. Whole sectors of Velar-controlled space declared neutrality to escape asset seizure. An opportunistic species began filing suits for historic grievances, now actionable under the ruling. The galaxy had not seen war, but it had seen collapse in the tribunal's silent post-verdict chamber. Dara didn't smile. She sat alone at the defense table, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her reflection barely visible in the polished obsidian floor. Lincoln flickered beside her, parsing reaction footage across 13 languages. "Victory parameters achieved," he stated, monotone as always, opposing power neutralized through legal insolvency. Earth's sovereignty restored. Would you like a statistical projection of planetary economic gains? No, Dara whispered, voice rough with exhaustion. I just want to go home. But what was home now? Marcos found her in the observation deck hours later, staring out at the red veins of the collapsed Valari trade lanes. We broke them, he said, leaning against the rail, one hand on his knee. Didn't fire a single shot. Not bad for two freaks in a talking spreadsheet. We didn't win, Dara said quietly, eyes still locked on the stars. We just proved we could play their game better. He studied her for a moment. It's still a game, and people still suffer, she said. We turned a child's suffering into legal ammunition. Marcos lowered his gaze. That's the cost, isn't it? You tear down a system, you bleed with it. She nodded, but said nothing more. Then came Judge Harold, not in robes, not surrounded by guards, but alone, stripped of his authority. You understand what you've done? He asked softly. There will be chaos. The power vacuum will draw in worse things. The galaxy thrives on control. Quote, it thrives on silence, Dara replied. I broke that. He looked older now, smaller. I trained you to win cases, not to destroy civilizations. Dara met his gaze. Maybe that was your mistake. Later, as the Clarion prepared to return to Sol, the tribunal issued a formal commendation. Dara Lennox, defender of Earth, restorer of legal balance. But she refused the medal. She declined every interview. When asked to lead Earth's new galactic legal office, she stepped away. She visited Mars briefly, where refugee colonies were rebuilding. Then Earth, where Eli's old grave sat beneath a tree in the outskirts of a decommissioned drone field. She sat beside it for hours, said nothing at last. She recorded one message, not for the press, not for the tribunal, but for the next lawyer who might find themselves facing an empire alone. They will tell you the law is order, that justice is balance, but sometimes the law is just paper wrapped around a blade. And sometimes the only way to make it just is to cut back. Then she vanished from public life, but across the stars, in legal halls and dusty courtrooms, her name began to circulate. Azimuth, as warning. As a whisper passed between those daring to fight back, Dara Lennox didn't win a case. She ended. An empire, Clarion, descended into Earth's orbit to a storm of global applause. But the returning delegation bore no laurels, no victory banners, only quiet purpose. For the first time in recorded history, an empire had fallen not to fleets or invasions, but to argument, to truth sharpened like a blade. Across the galaxy, species once silenced by debt, treaties, and corporate annexations found courage in Earth's trial. They called it the Quiet War. The verdict became more than precedent. It became myth. Humanity, once seen as reckless and primitive, had redefined the battlefield. The pen, once laughed at in galactic chambers, now carried the weight of extinction and salvation. Judge Harold, once a titan of jurisprudence, was arrested in silence, stripped of his robes and his reputation after tribunal investigators uncovered a lattice of bribes, influenced trades, and sealed backdoor deals that had manipulated decades of galactic rulings. He offered no defense. Perhaps he knew there was none left. The courtroom that once echoed with his judgments now bore his sentencing. The galaxy did not mourn him. Dara offered his former seat on the Universal Tribunal Ethics Board, a lifetime post of immense power and diplomatic immunity, refused without ceremony. The problem isn't the seat, she told the press. It's the tower we built around it. Instead, she poured her time and remaining credits into founding JusticeNet, a decentralized, open-source legal aid network run by human and allied volunteer jurists, interpreters, and AI assistants. The goal was simple: teach the galaxy how to fight with the law before it ever bleeds. Within weeks, species from collapsed mining colonies, refugee enclaves, and debt-slaved trade rings logged on. The network lit up like a rebellion in slow motion, one signature at a time. Arcos, Vale, weary and limping, returned to the rust-red soil of Mars, to the colony where his nightmares first began. He planted his old service medals in the dirt next to a tree struggling through synthetic air and finally allowed himself to breathe. He had launched missiles once, K. He'd helped rewrite the terms of power. A was enough, and Lincoln, eternal, cold, immortal, and Data, appeared one last time in Dara's office, flickering slightly in the corner like a candle, trying not to go out. Did we win? He asked, after calculating every economic and socio-political metric for 27 systems. Dara, leaning back in a cracked chair, stared out the window where Venus shimmered on the horizon. No, she said. We survived, and we made them listen. It's more than I ever thought possible. But there was still one last visit to make. Kay had a quiet memory park outside of Seattle. A grove of reconstructed sites allowed users to interact with their lost ones through holography and stored data profiles. Dara walked the gravel path alone, a datapad in hand, the final ruling encoded in its memory. When she arrived at the replica of her old apartment balcony, a scene pulled from Eli's personal archives, she found him there, smiling, sipping from a cracked mug, legs draped over the railing. The simulation was imperfect, but his voice was just right. It took you long enough. Dara sat beside him, her throat tight, the datapad trembling in her hands. I couldn't save you, she said softly, laying the ruling at his feet like a sacred relic. But I made sure they'll never do it again. The hologram tilted his head, then smiled wider. You changed the game. She nodded, eyes wet. No, we did. She stayed until the image flickered and dimmed, until the stars began to rise above the horizon. And when she left, the world felt quieter, not because the noise was gone, because, for once, she knew someone out there was listening. Maybe the war hadn't been fought with weapons. Maybe the last shot fired really was silence, but Earth had written something louder, future, one clause at a time. The stars had long moved on from the trial that shook the galaxy, but the ripples still touched distant worlds and a dust-choked mining colony in the Safel Rift. A young alien child with skin like molten glass sat cross-legged on a broken crate, eyes wide as they read from a weathered datapad, an excerpt from a public archive about the Earth Tribunal victory. Translated into dozens of dialects. They didn't use bombs, the child asked. No, came the soft reply from an older worker. Just words. The child looked up, glowing eyes burning with something brighter than curiosity. Then I want to be a lawyer. Across the galaxy, in a modest dome nestled into the red dunes of an unclaimed moon. Dara Lennox stood before a small classroom of species most galactic cultures still deemed unworthy of education. She wore no robe or no insignia. The only title the locals gave her was teacher. Her classroom was crude, stone benches, and open ceiling to the stars. Datapads, older than some of her students. But when she spoke of justice, they listened, as if it were air. She had turned down every award, refused every commission. Her credits were long gone, spent funding early iterations of JusticeNet until it became self-sustaining. She lived simply among the displaced, her fame fading into myth, just the way she liked it. One day, a young, persistent reporter tracked her down. She was older now, hair streaked with gray eyes, sharpened by years of war and peace alike. He asked the question carefully, almost apologetically. Don't you regret it, giving it all up? The title, power, the seat. Dara regarded him with the quiet patience of someone who had learned the weight of silence. She smiled faintly, then turned back to her class, or a spheric child with 6 arms was trying to understand the difference between intent and action in contractual ethics. You don't win a war to feel proud, she said at last. You win it so others don't have to fight. Later that night, she stood outside beneath the stars, listening to the soft murmur of her students debating over a case study she had given them. The dark sky above, one faint constellation, looked oddly like the tribunal's old seal balanced scales curved into a spiral. She thought of Eli, of Marcos, of Lincoln, now reduced to open source code, and of the thousands of species who had found their voice through law, not war. She whispered a phrase she hadn't said in years. Clause 0. Humanity. The unspoken rule she had carried through every trial, every loss, every impossible victory. The camera pulled back as Dara walked back into the classroom. The light of stars mingling with flickering holoscreens surrounding her students. No swords, no flags, it's just minds, sharp, defiant, ready to carve a different future, not by fire, but by words that mattered.